Hi, this is attorney Joe Simons following up on an earlier video where I talked about my client who lives out of the country trying to get to trial, can't come here legally as of now, and the prosecutor and the judges are forcefully pushing back on our request to try to get to trial via Zoom. So here with me is my client who has agreed to speak about the situation, what he's gone through, and a bit about his background. So welcome.
Thanks, Joe. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, so thanks for being here. This is sort of unconventional, but after I posted that last video, we got a lot of feedback, some support, and a few comments about suggestions. So we thought maybe by putting this out there, somebody would have an idea of something that we haven't yet tried. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. I was born in the Dominican Republic, and at the age of 4 years old, my mother emigrated over to the United States, and she petitioned for me. And in 1991, that was granted, and I arrived in the U.S. On a permanent residence at 4 years old.
And do you remember any of that coming over here?
Yeah, a little bit. I remember going to school initially. That was the first time I ever went to school. So I remember like getting on the school bus and things like that. And just growing up as a regular kid in the North Shore is what I remember.
After you came to the United States with your mom, did you live in Massachusetts the entire time?
Yes, the entire time. Once arriving there in 1991, I lived there for the next 20 years and only came back to the Dominican Republic twice for maybe a month each time.
So suffice to say, you really grew up and your whole life was here in the North Shore in Massachusetts.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all I knew. Growing up, I didn't know I was any different from my friends. I just thought I was a regular kid. In my mind, I didn't know what immigration was, or the fact that I was an alien, as they call it, and the fact that I had a green card. I wasn't thinking about any of that. Just kind of growing up. My mother was just working as a housekeeper at the Marriott Hotel, so she was just focused on giving her son the best future possible. So that's kind of my upbringing.
Did you know anything about your immigration status before you ultimately were removed from the United States?
I knew that in 2001, I did have to renew my green card. So I knew there was a process involved in going up to and taking pictures and getting my passport. I knew that, but I didn't know what impact it had in terms of me not being the same as my friends. So I knew that I had to do processes, but I just thought I was living there and I was part of the U.S.
All right, so let me flash forward to 2005. What were you doing at that point in life?
At that point, I was a senior in high school. I attended Salem High School and then briefly Peabody High School. So I was 17 years old and a senior.
All right, and when you were 17, you ended up getting into a little bit of trouble, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I was charged. I got in a little bit of trouble, and there were some charges filed against me. The first set of charges being an accident. So there was a personal injury accident on the road where I was alleged to be driving, and there were some charges levied against me of leaving the scene of a personal injury accident, marked lanes violation, and negligent operation of a motor vehicle.
All right, and just to be clear, without getting too much into the facts, there was no permanent injuries involved here, right?
No.
Okay, and obviously we'll leave this to the court, but as the attorney here who's seen the case, there are defenses in this case, but I'll leave it at that for now. There was a second set of charges that came out close in time, right?
Yeah, so when that initially happened, several months later, I had to move high schools because when that accident happened, even though I was a minor, my name was put in the newspaper, and I was going to a high school in a different city than where I lived because I moved to a different city when I was about a junior, and I didn't really want to move high schools because I felt it was a big deal at the time. I was only had a year left. So when that accident happened, I was moved to a new high school, a new set of friends, new situation. And a month into that new high school, I was charged with assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, which was a BB gun, and a dangerous weapon on school grounds.
Okay. And when you were charged with these two sets of cases or these two sets of charges, were you going to court back and forth for a period of time?
Yeah, it was a very lengthy process. When the initial accident happened, the hit and run, I was out on bail. That was an open case. So when the second circumstance happened, I was detained for 60 days as a high school senior. And then I went to court consistently every month for about a year and a half, trying to resolve these cases.
And the crazy thing too, that I had mentioned to you offline, is that if you were charged today as a 17-year-old, you would have been in juvenile court and probably treated much differently.
Right, right. At the time, I didn't understand why I was taken to jail as an adult. At 17, I was in high school. Looking back at it now, I'm going to be 36 soon. I was just a child at the time. I didn't know anything. So I'm surprised that back then the law was 17, you're an adult in Massachusetts.
Yeah, up until about 10 years ago, and then they changed it to now 18 is the age of you going to adult court, absent, some crazy murder charge or something like that. So over the course of these cases, you had a court-appointed lawyer at the time, right?
Right, right.
And
I couldn't afford an attorney, so I had a court-appointed lawyer.
And presumably you didn't know much about the law. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm guessing you were relying on that person's advice.
Yeah, absolutely. At the time, at 17, I wasn't aware of laws, and especially in my situation, not being a citizen. So I was heavily relying on whatever that attorney said. I was kind of going with.
And ultimately, did that attorney advise you to resolve the case in some way?
Yes, yes. The advisement from that attorney was to take a plea deal to resolve the cases, and at that point, it was all, I was all for it because it was almost 2 years of going to court. My mother was going through it. So he said, stay out of trouble. This will go away. But there was no other advisement outside of that. And that's what I ended up doing.
And the specific term was a continuance without a finding for those charges?
That's correct. I believe so.
Okay. Essentially, you make an admission that there's enough evidence that a jury could convict you, and in exchange, as long as you stay out of trouble for a period of time, the case gets dismissed pursuant to the state courts.
That's right.
And so you ultimately went through that probationary period, and the cases got dismissed in the state, right?
Yes, yes, that's right. So I ended up doing 2 years of probation, staying out of trouble. After that, my life was kind of turned upside down because now at 18 years old, I was a felon. So it's very hard to get a job. I went into a depression for a few years, but yeah, pretty much stayed home for the entirety of the 2 years of probation. And I thought I was done at that point.
And you were able to persevere and get through it. And then was there a period of time where you thought everything was sort of okay, like this was behind you?
Yeah, around 2010 or so, I had been done with it. I had stayed out of trouble. I was about 22, 23, had a job, had a car, and I thought I was done with it. I had done my probation. Obviously, I knew I was a felon. I knew it was tough for me to get certain jobs. So I had gone through some things, but I thought I had done enough to put that in the past.
And so at some point you went to travel outside of the country, right?
Yeah, in 2011, I decided that after 10 years, I wanted to learn more about my roots. So being in the US so long, I did have an urge to learn more about where I came from. So in 2011, I went to the DR. I have a half sister here, and I decided to kind of meet her. We had met as kids, but I decided to want to learn more about DR and meet her. And that's when I came down to the Dominican.
And was this just like a vacation sort of, like, or I should
Yeah,
say like a finite period of time you were going to come visit?
yeah, yeah. It was 3 weeks, so I got 3 weeks vacation from work, and I came for that period of time.
And then, so what happened when you came back to the United States?
When I entered the U.S., upon coming back from that vacation, I was detained by immigration, and I was very confused. And they said to me, did you get in trouble back? And they started mentioning the cases, and I said yes, but that's all resolved. I went through probation, and then they told me that I hadn't resolved it on the immigration side, and that's when I kind of started to learn about the fact that, hey, I'm not the same. Yes, you were born and raised, well, not born here, but you were raised in the US, but you're not the same. And aside from the criminal case, you also have to resolve it on the immigration side. And at that point, I was put into removal proceedings, is what they called it, because of those charges.
And up until then, when you came back, you were planning to just resume your job and resume your regular life here?
Yeah, yeah. The plan was to continue my job. The company was called Wetmore Company in Wilmington, Mass, and I had a great position there in their warehouse, and that was the plan. But that wasn't the idea that immigration had when I came back.
it was then, or sometime around there, you figured out that even though in the state court it's considered a continuance without a finding that gets dismissed at the end, it actually counts as a conviction for federal immigration purposes.
Yeah, that's when I found that out, and I was very, I want to say, I don't know if hurt is the word, but I was upset because I thought I had done enough. I'd gone through it. My mom had gone through it, and then to find out that, hey, even though you resolved it on the criminal side, you do have a whole set of other problems. So that was very eye opening to learn about that, and that was very disappointing and hurt at the time.
And so you basically were forced to sort of set up a whole new life down in the DR after not having lived there since you were about 4, right?
Yeah, yeah. So at that point, I was removed from the U.S. in 2011. I had to come down to the DR, and I had the half sister, but outside of that, no other connections, and kind of had to start over. And luckily, I knew English, so I had to go to a call center, earning a few dollars an hour, and kind of had to restart. My mother, stayed over there in the U.S. She had her job, and she's there now. She's 72 years old, and she became a U.S. citizen in 2008. But it makes more sense for her to live there with her health complications and her health insurance.
And one thing that I admire is that you have a really positive attitude in general. So I know you've made the best of it. You've started a family, and you're doing well, as well as you can in the situation. But I imagine it's hard not being able to come here and see your mom or resume life here with your family, given the circumstances.
Yeah, yeah, it is very tough. I try to be as positive as possible, but to be honest, it's not always easy. I did kind of start over here. I have 2 beautiful daughters. One is 7 and one is 5. So part of my motivation to get back is to give them the future and the education that I had, and obviously reunite with my mother, take care of her so she's not alone. But yeah, I've tried to be as positive as possible and get through it.
So, and this was back in what, 2010 or 11 that you went on that trip and weren't able to come back. So I think you and I didn't find each other until about 2018 or so.
Yeah, yeah. So 2011, I came back to the DR. At that point, I didn't know what the avenue was to try to get back or how to fight this at that point. Because of the charges, there was some issues on the immigration side, and then I ended up looking a few years later on the criminal side, and that's where we connected. And I think around 2018, and that's when we talked about maybe, hey, let's reopen the criminal case, and that's an avenue back, and we were successful with that.
Yeah, so and that took a little while, but I remember at first I had to get the file, and thankfully your prior attorney actually still had the file. So back then, though, I think there were some of the recordings we had were still on some like mini tape. They weren't even a cassette. They were some sort of mini tape. Had to get them converted, and so eventually we went all the way to a contested hearing, and over the prosecutor's strong objections, we convinced the judge to vacate those pleas because they weren't knowing, because you weren't advised of any immigration consequences, and you were deprived of your right to effective counsel. So that was kind of a big win, and that probably happened maybe 2021.
Yeah, that was 2021, and I was allowed to do that via Zoom. So that was great that we were allowed to do that. And going into that, I knew the chances were slim, maybe 20-30% of getting a case that's 17 to 15 years old reopened. But yeah, when that happened, that really got my hopes up in the fact that, hey, this was something, someone sees that this was unfair, the judge agreed, and it was reopened. And at that point, I kind of got new life and wanted to pursue it further. And hopefully I felt I was getting closer.
I really felt like that was a big win. And if you remember, I had tried to get an affidavit from your prior attorney about whether or not he gave you immigration advice or not. Didn't end up giving me an affidavit, and instead gave an affidavit that was favorable to the prosecution, to the prosecutor, which was disappointing, at least to me. And again, the prosecutor really was adamant against us and made every single argument they could. So I thought, to me, that was the big hurdle. I thought, we got over that, vacating the convictions. And from the attorney standpoint, I've done a lot of those, and of the successful ones, most of the minor cases or older cases like this, prosecutors just sort of drop. They realize, look, whatever happened, this guy paid the price. It's not justice to, seek a trial. But in this case, they really haven't let it go. They're trying to push both cases to trial. and yet they're also trying not to let you get to trial, because as of now, as far as you understand it, are you able to come back to the US legally?
No. So the interesting part is we got that win in 2021 with getting the cases reopened, but I'm in kind of a catch-22 now. And I think forever, unless something changes, where you're right. When I looked into this, when I got it reopened, most of these cases will either get dismissed or maybe there's something we can work out. In this case, the district attorney is adamant in taking this to trial and saying they have all this evidence and they want to be able to fight this. But I think it's a case of them knowing that I can't get back. So it's interesting because these charges don't allow me to get back. But at this point, I'm innocent because I was able to get it reopened. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at now.
Yeah, and so for the legal history part of this is there's really no precedent in Massachusetts anyway that specifically allows or disallows a defendant to appear via Zoom for his or her own trial. So we made arguments based on, other case law that isn't exactly on point, but we ultimately convinced the judge that not only you have a right to get to trial and to resolve the case, but also for any alleged victims or the public, they also have an interest in resolving this case. And the prosecutor should be seeking an end to it as well. So a judge actually agreed with us and set the case for trial via Zoom at first, which I was pretty surprised about. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I was surprised and I felt like it was a destiny type of thing. I was like, this is happening. It usually doesn't happen, but this judge sees it my way and that I should have my day in court. The victim should be able to confront me, all of that. Even though I'm not able to go in, I can get some resolution to this. And the judge allowed it. But then on the day that it was supposed to happen, she reverted back to saying no because it was a trial court rules. And that was disappointing because that just means that I'm in a position where I can't go back to fight it, but now I'll have a warrant out for my arrest. And so, yeah, that was very disappointing.
And it was the same judge that ultimately changed her mind. But even when she did, I had a sense that she was sort of felt bad about having to overrule herself and rule against us, because she actually took an unusual step and invited me and us to appeal her to the Supreme Judicial Court. So I thought that was a sign that she wanted to allow it, but felt constrained because there just wasn't any clear guidance allowing it.
I agree. I felt that way as well during that hearing. I felt like it was maybe a higher power or something that forced her to make that decision. And then we submitted that appeal, and we weren't successful, unfortunately. But I think it's a precedent thing, and I'm aware enough to know that some things are bigger than me. Even though I really want this to work out, I understand that there's rules for a reason, and if they allow this for me, this will open up a whole can of worms. So it's unfortunate, but that appeal was denied.
Well, and so now that was a appeal just procedurally to a single justice of the Supreme Judicial Court. The judge did take it up, wrote an opinion denying it, and now we're in the process of petitioning the full Supreme Judicial Court, so all 7 justices, to review it. They don't have to take it up. I'm hoping that they will, and I'm hoping that they collectively make some sort of carve out, even if it's not an outright, right for every defendant to appear on Zoom. That's not what we're looking for. It's a pretty small set of circumstances that would lead to this situation where somebody would be, where I think there'd be a compelling reason to allow for Zoom for somebody that wants to go to trial and can't physically be here. And otherwise, it's just going to be, like you said, in perpetuity. You're going to be in a warrant status and nobody's going to have a resolution. So that's the current status right now. We're petitioning. I'm working on a brief to the full Supreme Judicial Court and hoping for the best up there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to continue fighting, until I have those 2 daughters to kind of work for. So until it's really over, I'm not going to stop trying. And I hope that maybe out of this, something will come. I appreciate the recap that you did. And I know there was some questions about the charges or what happened. So I hope that this provide some clarity to people, and maybe someone has an idea of what avenue I could go and something that I could do aside from that appeal.
Yeah, and like I said, if anybody has ideas, suggestions, put them in the comments. And other than that, thank you for your time, and we'll hopefully report back with some good news soon.